So having established that literacy skill is profoundly important to our individual outcomes and to our collective economic and social success, we're going to turn now to explore what the current supply of literacy skill is that the Canadian economy might use, and what the current demand for literacy skill is implied by the distribution of employment by occupation in the country. We're going to begin by looking at how the demand for literacy skill has changed over the past couple of years. This chart plots the change in the numbers of jobs at level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it shows quite clearly, because of the slope of the black line, that the economy, the labor market, is knowledge and skill intensifying at a very rapid rate. We're shedding level 1 and 2 jobs, and we're adding level 3, 4, and 5 jobs, which is exactly what we need to do if we're to compete with the rest of the world. So skill demand is rising rapidly, something that's good, but it also begs the question of where that skill might come from to satisfy the emerging demand. Another way of looking at the demand is by skill level, and what we see is most jobs in Canada, by the dark green bars, require level 3 at least some of the time. A much smaller percentage require level 2 jobs, and about 22% require level 4 jobs, and about 10% are level 5 jobs. Coming back to the issue of supply, we've done projections of the supply of literacy skill out to 2031. These two charts look at supply out to 2016. It shows on the left-hand panel a steady decline in the numbers of people at level 1 and 2 and flat numbers at level 3, 4, and 5. If we look at the right-hand panel, it plots the proportions of people at each literacy skill level expected out to 2016. Currently, we're about 48% of the adult population is at level 1 and 2. This percentage is only going to fall a tiny bit to about 45% by 2016. And so the supply is not projected to grow rapidly, and we will continue to have large numbers of people with level 1 and 2 skills below the level we need for them to be competitive and for us to compete collectively in global markets. We now are going to turn to look at the utilization of the available literacy supply in Canada. Literacy is an economic asset, something that allows us to earn our way in the world. We currently, at the Canada level, only use 66% of that available supply. So were we able to find ways to raise the utilization rates, we'd also become wealthier. The province that uses the least literacy supply in Canada is the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, where they're only using about 53% of the available supply. Newfoundland and Labrador could realize big increases in GDP per capita and productivity growth by finding ways to increase employment levels and the skill intensity of employment to drive up that utilization rate. In sharp contrast, the province of Alberta uses 71% of the available supply, so they're using a significantly greater proportion, and there's very little room for them to push that utilization up any further without having a negative impact on wage rates by driving wage inflation. If we look at this at the aggregate level by province and territory, we can divide the provinces into two. One, a group of provinces at the top of this chart, New Brunswick, Quebec, Newfoundland and Labrador, Ontario, and Prince Edward Island, where literacy skill demand exceeds the available supply. So the jobs are more demanding than the skills that the workers can bring to meet that demand. The other half of the provinces actually are in the situation where supply exceeds the available demand. So they have more skills than the economy is currently able or willing to soak up. What this implies is a need for a very diversified remedial strategy. The policy to deal with the issue will vary depending on whether the province is in literacy skill shortage or surplus. Now we're going to turn to something troubling. Canada has realized one of the longest uninterrupted periods of economic growth of any country in the world since the Second World War. And we've rapidly increased the supply of literacy skill by pushing more people through the education system and having them stay there longer. We also, unfortunately, see a phenomena that was unexpected when we began this work. This chart shows the magnitude of skill loss that occurred in Canada between 1994 and 2003. The red line is the distribution of skill by age observed in 1994. The blue line is that same distribution of skill by age for the same people observed 9 years later. And the fact that there's a gap between those two curves suggests that a significant number of Canadian adults found a way to lose a good share of the literacy skills that the education had given them. This suggests in turn that there's a literacy skill demand deficit in Canada. Demand is not currently high enough to make sure that all of the available literacy skills are put to good economic use. This comes back to our conclusion earlier in the presentation that government policy needs to be balanced. It needs to do things to raise demand, it needs to do things to increase supply, and it needs to take steps to make sure that Canada's labour markets are more efficient at matching worker skills with the demands of the jobs in which they work. If we continue this story of utilization, we've compared the actual skills of workers to the demands of their occupation, and it comes as some surprise that fully half of all workers have lower literacy skills than their occupations require them to have to work safely and productively. A little more than 30% are in balance, which is a good thing in the short run, but given that demand is rising so rapidly, these workers have no cushion upon which to meet that rising demand. And finally, a little less than 20% of workers are in literacy skills surplus. They have skills that the current economy is not putting to economic use. So finding ways to increase employment and the skill intensity of employment would yield dramatic and sustained economic growth. So given that profile of literacy skills surplus and shortage in the Canadian labour market at the national level, we now turn to what we know about the nature of those skill shortages, how far people are away from their desired level, what it would take to raise their level to that required by their job, what that would cost, and finally what benefits would ensue were someone to invest the money to eliminate occupational literacy skill shortages at the national level. So if we turn to what it would cost to fix the problem given the nature of the learning needs of adults, workers in literacy skill shortage, for employed people we need a little more than $11 billion to eliminate their skill shortages. For the recently employed, people who've worked in the last 5 years but are not currently working, they have an occupation, we need about $2 billion to fix their problem. For those who are out of the labour market, the group that the labour market has systematically excluded because of their skill, we need to spend $16 billion to give them the skills to participate in the economy fully and fairly. These are big numbers by any measure, and so finding that money will depend on having individuals invest, having their employers invest, and having governments invest. Were the government to invest, or any combination of those economic actors, one would expect to see rapid increases in productivity growth, followed by rapid increases in wages and earnings. That growth would be so large that we're looking at rates of return on that investment of anywhere between 224% to 372%. Handsome dividends by any standard. And the fact that these returns would happen each and every year following the investment makes the investment all the more attractive. So by way of summary, Canada's future economic success, our ability to compete, and the rate at which we progress socially will depend on investing in literacy. If we invest in literacy, we could reduce the level of social inequality we see in all of the things we value most: employment, income, health, and participation in the democracy and in the broad society. If we fail to do so, we'll hemorrhage jobs to the third world, and incomes and employment levels will fall. So finding a way to invest in literacy will become crucially important. The situation facing Aboriginal peoples in Canada is particularly dire. They tend to work in jobs that are less demanding. They have lower skills, so their literacy shortages are significantly bigger than non-Aboriginal populations. So dealing with Aboriginal populations' literacy skill problems is one of the policy priorities for Canada and the provinces and territories. A failure to do that will lead to long-term economic deprivation, and given that Aboriginals are one of the key sources of net labor growth in the country, ignoring their problems will hurt us all. I look forward to working with Canada's governments and Aboriginal peoples to try to fix that challenge. Thank you. Want to know more about literacy? Go to any of the following websites shown on the screen: the website for Data Angel, the website for Statistics Canada, the website for Bow Valley College, or the website for the Canadian Council on Learning. You'll find out about how important literacy is to Canada's future economic competitiveness and our collective well-being. Thank you.